Hi everyone, this is benrlego. I wanted to do a video today discussing some chess concepts, primarily the concept of contempt, which basically just means that when we play against an opponent that is much lower skilled than we are able to take advantage of that fact and play moves that otherwise would not be very tactically sound or would just be risky. But since our opponent is much weaker, they will not be able to adequately form a defense against our moves, and we can move very quickly and try to get quick mates. Now this is something that of course will scale, regardless of the elo of the individual players. It just depends on what the golf of the elo is. In this case, it is about 600 points golf between me and my opponent, and I am black here. And so we will see white open up with pawn to e4, very typical opening, and I will respond with e5. And then immediately, white puts itself in a weak position by playing bishop to b5. Now this is a very poor development of the bishop and a very unnecessary one because it simply allows for me to repel it with the pawns. It does not threaten any pieces that really matter because here obviously if it were to attack I would just recapture with any piece of my choosing. So this is a very poor development, very poor opening. We would rather see something like this knight be played to c3, which at the very least will protect the pawn. Or alternatively, we could see something like this knight played to f3, which then attacks my pawn that I have developed. But instead, we see this pointless move. Now I decide to simply ignore this. I ignore this move altogether. I could chase it, but I don't. And I play knight to f6, now threatening the pawn that it has developed, which is completely undefended. Of course, defenders could be introduced, but I have at least some pressure on the center with my knight. Now white could, of course, once again, counter this by playing its knight to c3. Or, alternatively, it could play the bishop that it had just played to here, to d3. Instead, it does not do so. It simply plays knight to e2, which is baffling. At the very least, you could see something like it being played here to f3, which would at the very least, like I say, threaten that. But it does not do that. It plays this pointless move, which completely obstructs the board, because now this piece cannot retreat to undo its poor decision. And it is a loss of tempo. Once again, at this point, I am very sure that white is going to blow this game, and I decide simply to attack that bishop, which is now effectively stuck. It cannot fully retreat, and it cannot properly defend the center of the board. So I pursue it, and instead of perhaps retreating somewhere where it can at least do something, I see white play possibly the worst move of the game, but that's hard to say, and it captures the pawn on c6, which of course presents a lot of opportunities for recapture for effectively no gain. I choose to capture with knight to develop it, and again puts good development on my knights in the center, and white is stuck in this awkward position. At this point, white is definitely scrambling and realizes that it has made a mistake, and it plays another poor move. It plays that knight to f4. Again, a useless move. It could have played something like this to at least put some pressure on the center, so that way I cannot capture. But it does not do that. Instead, we see this useless move, because at this point this knight cannot move much further. It cannot attack because this square is heavily defended, and again, same here. So this is effectively useless. It also, quite clearly, enables the opportunity for a capture. which is very suicidal because now you've just thrown away 2 minor pieces for nothing. So I decide once again to simply ignore this. I am not going to worry about it because it does not have any threat on my pieces. I continue my own development, and I move for a quick mate. I capture the pawn on e4 with my knight, which again cannot be recaptured at all, and we put some pressure on the pawns near the center. Now, at this point, white does have the option to threaten my knight by playing that, but instead it scrambles and plays, and I believe this was a mistake, it plays the rook to f1 instead of castling. I don't see how that isn't just a mistake done in haste, but that does happen, and now this presents a wonderful opportunity for me. I play bishop to c5, which now threatens a check, because I can simply play the bishop to f2, which checks. And white has a baffling response by playing knight to c3. Again, it could have played something else, most certainly, but it's not the worst move because at least it does threaten this, but it does not resolve the situation of the check in the slightest, because I simply can avoid this attack, which is what I do. I move for the check, which immediately puts major pressure on the king and effectively sacrifices a rook, because the best opportunity here for white is to recapture this bishop with its rook and then lose it to my knight, which puts white in a very weak position, but at least it survives. Instead, it plays a very, very baffling decision, which is king to e2. This, of course, allows me to simply play knight to d4 and check. At this point, white resigns the game. I do not blame it for resigning. Obviously, it's in a very precarious position. The best move here would have been for, of course, rook to f2, and then my knight would capture, and king can recapture it, and then play can continue. Along those lines, I can check. I can check, it can counter with the pawn, I can check once again, it can block with the knight. Obviously now that my queen is perfectly safe, I can castle. It can play something like pawn to d3, so now it can develop its bishop. I can play my knight to d4. It can play its bishop now. I can move my queen. Moves its knight. You can see just the play threatens my knight now. I play queen to f5, check, and it plays bishop to f4 to block it. And so this is a poor position for white, of course. Very poor position. But that would have been at least a way for it to try to continue play instead of resigning. Or another alternative here would be for white to simply move its king out of danger, which then allows me to play knight to c5 for another check, and then it will move out of check again. I bring my queen into play here, protecting the knight. It obviously threatens my queen with its knight, so I move it to safety. It can play check on c7. I can then obviously simply recapture the knight, and I'm still protecting that one, so no problem. Play something like that, then I respond with the check. Knight captures, threatening my queen. Instead, I put another check that it has to respond to, and it simply moves out of the way, and now my queen is free to move, and check. Then it blocks. Knight, check, once again, no problem there. Moves, and checkmate. So you can see effectively how white has destroyed its position, and it cannot play on. If it had decided to play on, I would have mated it very easily. And that just gives you a strong example of how you can tell. Usually, if things fall apart for a bad player in the opening, it is very easy to take advantage of it here. And you can make these aggressive moves, ignoring your opponent. Because, once again, their defense is just, it is not suited to the kinds of attacks that you can respond with. And so we have opened up very nicely here and played a very strong game with very little material loss and a very quick mate. So I hope that was a good example of contempt, and I hope that you learned something from this video. And let me know what you think of the commentary here in terms of using the software. I think this is rather interesting, having the option to do this way with chess base. But in any event, I will catch you guys later.